I was the last person in my life to realize that I'm supposed to be a writer. Everybody else,
Really?
yeah, everybody around me was sort of like, well, obviously you're going to be a writer like your dad, right? And I, in my adolescent years, I was like, absolutely not. I'm going to be an actor. You know, I'm totally different from I'm not just going to follow in my dad's footsteps. Like, that's too unoriginal. And so it took me a long time to feel confident enough in my individuality that I could admit the ways in which I am very like my father.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking to one of the truly rising stars, young stars in American and world conservative Christian media, and talking about a new book that he's just released, and also an earlier book that he's written. I've read both of them, and they're just beautifully written prose. We're so blessed to have on the show today Spencer Klavan. Welcome to Grey Matter, Spencer.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be here, and thanks for that very kind introduction.
Yeah, well, I mean it sincerely. I really have admired your work from afar, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. Before we dive in and talk about your two books and other things with you, we're going to do as we always do. We have our framing aphorisms on the show. These are made somewhat in your honor as a classicist. The first one is, that man is best who sees the truth himself. Good, too, is he who listens to wise counsel, but who is neither wise himself nor willing to ponder wisdom is not worth a straw. That's Hesiod. And then, of course, from another very wise man from the Old Testament, King Solomon, who wrote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." That's from Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. From someone who's a friend and an admirer of our guest, actually wrote a very nice foreword to his most recent book, Stephen C. Meyer, who wrote, "The heart cannot exult in what the mind rejects." And finally, from another ancient Grecian giant of thought, Sophocles, who wrote, "One word frees us of all the weight and pain of life, and that word is love." So who do we have on the show today? Spencer Klavan, author of Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God. He is a scholar, a writer, and a podcaster. Graduate of Yale, he earned his doctorate in ancient Greek literature from Oxford University. He's the author of the acclaimed book, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. It's a brilliant book. I really enjoyed it. He's also the editor of Gateway to the Stoics. He's also the host of the Young Heretics podcast and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He's written to many outlets, including The Atlantic, Los Angeles Times, City Journal, Newsweek, The Federalist, The American Mind, and The Daily Wire. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee. And that's not all he's done, folks. There's also something called The New Jerusalem that we're going to talk about. Anyway, Spencer, it's great to have you here. I want to talk about your books, but before we go there, I have kind of a personal question I want to ask you about. Now, your father, Andrew Klavan, is a brilliant, one of the best known American novelists, especially in, of course, mystery and crime stories. I happen to think that his podcast is the best one out there. I admire that show very much, and actually, that's how I was introduced to you. And one of the great things about your collaboration with your father, and this is what I want to ask you about as a father myself, because I have a 20-year-old son. You and your father have a very beautiful and sophisticated relationship. And frankly, I envy it very much. And so I'm interested to know how you and your father have been able to sort of work out and sort of transcend this sort of chasm between father-son, whereas now your colleagues, and I just listened to a recent interview you did with your father about his new book, which is in the Cameron Winter series, and it just, there's a collegiality and a respect there, but you still have retained that father and son relationship, but it's obviously you're very close, but there's a mutual respect. How were you and your father able to achieve that? It really is a wonderful thing to experience.
Oh, well, thank you. And it's one of the chief joys of my life. So it's actually a great blessing to be able to share that with other people. We're lucky, I think my dad and I both, that we work in the same field, and that field is a very personal field. Even if, as like me, you write about nonfiction subjects and it's not necessarily the most emotional or narrative art, you still end up going on interviews, talking to people, and that's what intellectual life is ultimately about. It's about connection and about offering thoughts to others. And so we're lucky that we get to let people in a little bit on this very special relationship, as you say. And what we're really lucky about, I think, is that we don't have to fake it. We're not here performing father son affection, filial piety, any of that. It's just a part of our life that has naturally grown out into the wider kind of dimension of our respective careers. I always start here by saying that we're very lucky, my dad and I, in that I think all fathers and sons naturally tend to love each other or to care very deeply for each other. Of course, there are tragic situations in which that relationship can be broken, but there's a natural, even I would almost call it an animal bond, not in a pejorative way, just that this is
Right.
an affection that grows automatically out of biological relationship.
Hmm.
But then, as you indicate, we're also friends, and one is lucky in one's life if one has few very, very close friends. And if one of those very close friends happens to be your father, then you've really won the lottery, because it's
Hmm.
like layering over another relationship, another kind of love onto that original familial love.
Hmm.
And I will say that although we have not had a turbulent relationship, that the transition from father son to friendship was a dynamic one. That it mostly had to do with my own growing into maturity, and I think every father son pairing has the painful experience of realizing that in order to grow, you have to break away, and that's painful for both the parent and the child. You know, you become your own person, your own man, and that did happen to me sort of as I went through my teenage years. And so I guess my advice, if I have any, to fathers and sons that are in this kind of journey, trying to learn how to relate to one another as adults, I would say, you know, that for the father, it's probably a process of letting go, that this is about coming to understand that this person you've known as dependent on you is going to now strike out on his own. You know, the Bible speaks of children as arrows in a quiver, and
Hmm.
often this is taken to mean that, you know, your children are your wealth, or your children are part of your kind of arsenal, and all of that can be true. But there's a reason that the Bible doesn't speak of children as swords in your hand, because your children have a trajectory, and arrows fly away from you, and that's proper and right. So you have to kind of learn on both sides to handle that and accept that, and then turn back toward one another. And on the son's part, I think there's an important lesson to be learned, which is that you are independent now, which means
Hmm.
that you are free. And whereas previously you were kind of obligated to your father, now it's up to you to freely choose to love and honor your
Hmm.
father, which is man's estate, to be able to make those free choices. And so,
Hmm.
just like the freedom that God gives us to live our lives as we choose, there's a purpose to that freedom, which is to choose the good. You will actually be destroyed by going off in sort of on dark paths, and God is not sort of scolding you or trying to ruin your fun by teaching you about virtue. He's inviting you into the dance of love, of freely chosen love. And this is the
Hmm.
same with fathers and sons, I think. So it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's a process that you have to learn to kind of accept step by step, but it's
Yeah.
obviously also the stuff of life.
Yeah. What sounds like that relationship and your approach to it, and also your father's, Andrew Klavan, no relation, is this faith, and that faith is also present in your writing. Your books just we don't know each other, but just so you know, I'm a lawyer by trade, but my undergraduate degree was I did an honors thesis in Shakespeare, and I read probably 2 to 3 books a week. And your 2 books are probably the most beautifully written prose I've seen in a long time. And I hope you take this in a complimentary way, but I've read as many of your father's books as I have of your books. I've only written 2 of your father's nonfiction books, The Great Good Thing and The Truth and Beauty, both of which are great. But your writing is something different. It's very unique. And I would say when I read your second book, I sort of felt it would fit squarely in between, Stephen Meyer's writings and a book that I read by Eric Metaxas, who we had on the show, called "Is Atheism Dead?" And you really treat beautifully in your most recent book this concept of the tension between science and religion. And this is not an easy topic, as you know. But I was reminded of a quotation here from Georges Lemaitre, who said, "There's no conflict between science and religion." And perhaps we could start there, because I think maybe that seems to be one of the main themes in your book that's different from some of the other books written on this topic. Is you don't seem to see science and religion at war. In fact, you see them as sort of moving in harmony. Do I have this right? Tell me what you think about this in terms of how you framed your second book.
Oh, well, thank you, first of all. And I think that you're onto something, which has to do, interestingly, with my particular place in my particular age and the time in which I grew up, and the fact that I am part of kind of an up and coming generation, as you mentioned.
Right.
I grew up surrounded by the so-called conflict between science and religion. And it was taken for granted in a lot of the circles where I moved that faith was an obstacle to belief in science. It's not that that obstacle couldn't be surmounted. It's that people just assumed there was a challenge there, that you would have your faith tested and challenged if you looked at the sciences. And likewise, if you went into the sciences, you would be hard pressed to justify your faith. And I really do think that this emerged from kind of the high noon of the new atheism, which was in itself a product of hundreds of years worth of propaganda about the conflict, the war between science and religion. And I think the purpose of this new book, Light of the Mind, what really makes it distinctive in this field, is that I really start out by announcing this attitude is out of date. This is an attitude that once seemed very prevalent, but now can be kind of swept away. And it can be swept away both from a scientific perspective, because science itself is now moving in a direction that seems to need a spiritual or religious outlook to make sense out of it. But also it can be swept away from a religious perspective, because those of us that believe don't have anything to fear from science. And I think that, getting a handle on that, taking stock of that, and really realizing that that is where we're starting now, is a step down a new road that those of us that grew up with this idea of the war between science and religion, it might seem a bit strange at first. The subtitle of the book is Illuminating Science Through Faith, which would have sounded very provocative 10 years ago. But now that the new atheism has kind of passed away, a lot of people are starting to realize that you need some kind of supernatural or transcendent or metaphysical way of looking at the world to make sense of it. And so I think that, it is absolutely, perhaps the quality of the writing that you're describing arises out of that delight, that there's actually nothing to fear here, that we actually have new discoveries to make about what we already know, that can now be incorporated into a more confident vision of the world that includes science and faith and endorses them both.
One of the things I really appreciate about this book is you really don't skimp on the science. It's obvious that you spend a lot of time, even though you're trained as a classicist and obviously have a deep understanding of literature. You spend a lot of time getting into the guts of science and really studying not only the history of science, but the new science, how it ties into threads like atheism. What was that process like in researching that part of the book? Because it seems to me, I don't know if you have a scientific background, but it doesn't seem that you do. Was that a challenge, or was that an exciting thing for you to go off and do that research in sort of quote unquote hard science and dealing with some of the writings of people like Dr. Meyer?
Yeah, well, it was both, I would say. It was daunting and it was also exciting. I don't have a background beyond the college level in the sciences. My graduate work, as you indicate, was all in literature.
Hmm.
Always had a love, an amateur's love for science, and certainly in school, it was something I paid a lot of attention to and really enjoyed, but I'm in no way an expert. As I say at the opening of the book, there's a way in which I'm a bit of an interloper or a trespasser in these scientific fields. But one of the things that I think is different about our age right now, from say even 10, 20 years ago, is that we used to have this idea that in education you sort of you learn about everything and you're a generalist for most of your youth, and then suddenly you become a specialist in only one area.
Right.
And you probably experienced this in law school, I would imagine,
Yeah.
that you might have had any manner of intellectual interests, and they might have been important. And as you say, you studied Shakespeare, right? So suddenly these routes get closed off to you. And there's an element of that that's natural. You need to specialize in order to become an expert in anything. But there's an element of it in our day that I think has gone way too far, to the extent that people who count themselves experts in certain areas shut themselves off from other forms of knowledge. And this is especially true in, I think, the sciences, and even some of now the literary fields have gotten like this. But we are really entering into an age, I've been calling it the age of the generalist. We're really entering into an age where we need to be talking to one another. And those of us who specialize in one field need to take other fields seriously. So whereas I'm never going to be the guy who tells you like, oh, we've discovered a new quasar. You know, I just don't have the expertise, and never will have the expertise to resolve the paradoxes in quantum gravity or anything like that. I do think that it's possible for a generalist to gain with care and attention and with respect, to gain a solid understanding of the concepts that are at work in science. And it's urgent, because if Christians and scholars of literature abandon these fields to people who are totally uninterested in this matters of spiritual import, then we will be putting ourselves at this enormous disadvantage that other, essentially atheists, are the only ones who know about the physical world. And I don't really think that's necessary at all. I hope this book is very readable. I hope it's
It is.
engaging.
Mhm.
Thank you. But and again, it's not, you won't find a single equation in the book. You know, it's
Mhm.
not there to teach you what the laws of planetary motion are in their mathematical form. But I did spend a lot of time kind of thinking about and in my own way, you know, to my own degree of competency, working out with my calculator and with the help of some very excellent physics lectures that have been written down by Leonard Susskind. You know, I did spend some time in the weeds, so that the story that I'm telling about science will be based in the reality of what scientists are looking at. And I do think that that's actually possible, and that we shouldn't be afraid of it, because if we are, then we'll just kind of be at the mercy of people that do specialize in these areas, and then they'll pronounce, as they often, we saw in COVID, right? We saw all these scientists pronouncing on politics and on theology sometimes, and you know, there's a lot of terrible errors that we can fall into if we simply leave this entire field of knowledge only to those that are hostile to
Yeah.
religion.
So, Spencer, you've really turned a really an astounding trick here in the sense that you've produced a work that is admired by people who are very, very deep scientists. And I know that I listened to an episode of The Young Heretics where one of your friends, who's obviously a very advanced scientist, expressed admiration for the book and the science in it. But at the same time, it's very readable for people like myself who are not scientists, who are lay people. And that's not something that's easy to do. You must have spent a fair amount of time thinking about the voice and the way that you would construct the language in the book. Was that something that you spent some time on, or did it just sort of flow naturally, like like Mozart and
I wish.
Amadeus?
Oh boy, yeah, wouldn't that have been great if I just sort of came up with it in my sleep? No, there's one of my favorite quotations is by Cormac McCarthy, a terrific novelist, so in a field that's not my own. But he says books are made out of other books.
Right.
And this is what I tell people who are just a bit younger than me and aspire to write. The first thing I say is get out as quickly as you can, do anything else. No, but if it's something that you really are called to do, I say you have to read so much more than you think you do. If you think you're reading all the time, you probably need to read twice as much. And there's, our education system doesn't really fit us for this very well. That I was lucky to spend a fair bit of time, both as a child and as an adult, in the British education system, which is even now in our degraded age, the British education system is still very rigorous about its reading lists. And there are two reasons for this. One is that you just need to gather the information, and as we've been discussing, for somebody like me, there's a lot of information that needs gathering. If you're writing about science, you want to make sure that you're getting your facts straight and that you are getting reputable sources for that. But the other and less appreciated reason to read as much as possible is that good prose works its way into your bones, and it does so slowly. You need time in order for that kind of cadence of the authors you most admire to kind of almost infect you. It needs to work grooves into your mind. And I found this to be true if there's a particular author you really admire, especially if you're reading a lot of him, you'll start to sound like him in the same way that painters, will copy paintings by Rembrandt and try to incorporate that style. And so not only do you have to do that with your preferred authors, but you have to do that with so many different preferred authors that you develop your own voice that is a kind of amalgam of these with some of your own stuff in it. Authors that I love, like Tom Holland, if I had to say whom I aspire most to be like, it's somebody like Tom Holland who is writing very scholarly academic history, but writing it like a kind of novel or right. Like a gossip column almost. I mean, he has such a wonderful way. And this is kind of my attempt to do that in the intellectual history realm. And yeah, you just have to be constantly absorbing excellent prose, including novels. And then there is a degree to which, yes, like you wait for inspiration and you hope that there'll be, something given and revealed to you from outside of yourself. But mostly just read is the thing.
Yeah, well, obviously it's working. I want to talk about your first book, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. And for those, if you've not read this yet, I experienced this first as an audiobook before I bought the hardcover. And you did a brilliant job of narration. Obviously, you have a splendid voice for narration. But this book, I found fascinating. It's more of a philosophy book, although that maybe understates the case. But I almost read this one when I read the second one, not as sort of a sequel. The second one being a sequel, but they do sort of fit together, don't they? Was that by design, or is that just how it worked out? Because the first book is really talking about it's described here as a book to let you know you're not alone. The wisdom of the ages can guide us through the struggles of the present. The fate of our civilization depends on whether ordinary people internalize the truth and beauty conveyed in the masterpieces of Western culture. And I really see a lot of the things that you talk about in that book, like the crisis of reality, the crisis of the body, the crisis of meaning, crisis of religion. All these things really, in a lot of ways, are further explicated in your second book. Do you agree with that, first of all? And was that by design?
Yes, Vera, that's very astute. I think you're the second person to notice this. So it's interesting because I've been talking about this book, obviously, a fair bit since it came out last week. And to me, this is almost a sequel to How to Save the West, which is funny to say because they don't bear any immediately obvious relationship. And it's not as if I set out to write two books that would follow one after the other. It's more that every book is also a thought process. And if if you're doing your job right, you're also learning things and you're discovering things, and you will usually end up, and this has been true also of the second book, you will usually end up feeling as if there's a whole other unwritten book contained in the book that you just wrote. And so what happened with How to Save the West is that I outlined that book in terms of 5 crises that I think we are facing. And I sort of I outlined it in advance, the 5 things that I think we're struggling with in the West at a deep philosophical level. So they are reality, our relationship to our bodies, meaning, religion, and politics. And those are the 5 crises. But as I began to work them out, it became really clear to me that they're each linked to one another and that all of them lead up to the crisis of religion. That ultimately behind each of them, there is a problem that we're facing about whether we can believe in anything absolute beyond the material world. Mm-hmm. And so it was for that reason that, in the crisis of religion section, I ended up talking about the multiverse and dealing with all these sort of scientific issues that I did not expect to be dealing with. And when a book surprises you, that's the best thing. That's when you're really on to something exciting. And I thought, this is really the obstacle. This is what's keeping us from biting the bullet, is our sense, not our intellectual idea, but more our superstition or our ambient fear that on the other side of the leap of faith, there is irrationality and a kind of anti-science outlook. And so, yes, that this book came right out of that feeling and right out of an attempt to address what I think is kind of the core crisis and remove one of the major burdens that seems to be keeping people back from a healthy outlook on religion and so much else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We had Dr. Jay Bhattacharya on the program, who was a brilliant epidemiologist who teaches at Stanford, and he said something very interesting about science that I think ties into, when I read your books, it made me think of this. He described science as this great conversation across time, sort of an ask and report, a report and ask. And in the context of censorship, the censorship of science, the censorship of ideas, he tied that into the scientific discussion as another aspect of the suppression of free speech that's going on right now in your country and in my country throughout the Western world. What are your thoughts about that? I'm curious to know, based upon what you've written in your most recent book.
Well, I admire Dr. Bhattacharya so much, and this is the area where he seems to be such a morally clear thinker. Of course, he's a very skilled practitioner of his scientific discipline, but more importantly, almost than that, he's a morally clear thinker. And this brings to my mind one of the aphorisms that you began with from Hesiod, that wonderful line, the best thing is to have wisdom of your own, but failing that, rely on the wisdom of others. And if you won't even accept wisdom from others, you are truly sunk. You must really be self-destructive. And I think that there's an element, and this is certainly true in the later Greek tradition, there's a way in which Hesiod's being a bit coy there when he says, it'd be great to have your own wisdom, but at least rely on other people's. Because the truth is, none of us really has very much of our own wisdom. I don't know a single person. I mean, I know people that are more equipped and less equipped intellectually, that have more and less horsepower or gift.
We have Justin Trudeau in Canada.
That's right. Well, I'm terribly sorry. My condolences.
Well, you have Kamala Harris, is sort of like
it's true. It's just these things, it's like 6 on one hand, half a dozen on the other
right.
at this point. But there's a good example, actually. There's somebody who I don't think is very all too well equipped in the intellect department, but that's not what is awful about Kamala. There's plenty of wonderful people with a lot of wisdom who don't start out with a ton of gifts in the intellectual domain. It's her studious resistance to the wisdom of the past and the almost philosophical objection to learning from anybody who lived before you did that really makes up the heart of progressivism. And it's a very arrogant attitude, of course, because it suggests that we are the smartest people who have ever lived. But it's also a terribly impoverishing attitude. It's a way of shooting yourself in the foot, essentially, and depriving yourself of this enormous storehouse of wisdom, especially if you're closing off avenues to thought on ideological grounds, because you've predetermined that the conclusions other people draw are wrong, and therefore you don't want to hear their reasoning. I mean, that is the definition of circular logic. And so I would propose, that this is true in the scientific sphere, as Jay suggested, but that it's equally true the other way around. So I've thought about this since coming out with this book, that many people in the scientific domain are currently waking up to the necessity of some sort of spiritual outlook. And you see this among cosmologists, you see it in the tech world, people starting to talk about, well, maybe we live inside a simulation, or maybe there's aliens, there's got to be some power out there, right, that accounts for things. And I think this is actually very endearing because, it's sort of like if tomorrow I discovered for the first time that there's such a thing as the planet Saturn. Like if I had never thought about that before, and I just realized, oh my gosh, there's this whole entity out there in the heavens. The smartest thing for me to do in that case would be to consult a physics textbook, because that's where we have our best up-to-date information on the laws of mechanics and gravitational motion and all of these other things that would help me to understand the planet Saturn. That would be the wise thing to do, would be to consult what we figured out based on our best information, so that I don't take some of the paths that people have taken that are dead ends and make mistakes. If instead I thought, okay, I'm going to learn about Saturn just by figuring out what I personally can get to on the best available reasoning in my own head, I might end up somewhere like along the lines of Empedocles, right? I might get as far as the theory of the 4 elements if I really thought about it hard on my own. But that's not very far. And you sort of get the sense that people today in the spiritual realm and the ethical realm are doing the equivalent of trying to work out physics from their own personal resources. And you just want to say, like, look, we have a textbook. We have the scripture, not only is there scripture, there's a whole history of like people going down dead ends and saying, no, that's not quite right. And this is, this is what we call heresy. And it's not as if I think that nobody should believe anything other than the Nicene Creed, although I think the Nicene Creed is right. It's just, I think, if you're starting to think about these things, why not check out a physics textbook? Like, why not sort of start with the accumulated wisdom of the past? Sure. And this is kind of, I think, the condition we find ourselves in is a real allergy to accumulated wisdom in certain domains, whereas we're very comfortable trusting authority when it comes to certain laws of physics, let's say. We've got to reacquaint ourselves with authority when it comes to laws of wisdom.
Yeah, well, standing on the shoulders of giants is a good idea. But, talking about this, and just listening to you, it makes someone like Aristotle all that much more miraculous, doesn't it? I mean, he wrote about absolutely everything. He talked about literature and drama and the poetics, the politics, Nicomachean Ethics. It really is, and of course, as a classicist, in some sense, you're following in that line, aren't you? Because you're not shying away from a topic like science, even though maybe that's not your main area of knowledge or expertise. Had that occurred to you, or was this just sort of a flight of fancy that got you into science?
Yeah, well, I would definitely be embarrassed to compare myself with Aristotle. But the sense in which that may be right is that all knowledge, I think, is connected and is still connected. And what you get from the classics that's so wonderful is this sparkling vision of the disciplines interlocking with one another. And so Aristotle isn't writing about cuttlefish because that happens to be one of his interests. It's because the cuttlefish fits into this scheme, this system of biology and the study of living things, which in turn is a subspecies of the study of the soul, which in turn kind of leads to metaphysics. And these are all very closely related to one another. One of my favorite scholars in the modern day, Martin West, used to compare it to a climbing wall. You know, if you've got your hooks in one chunk of the climbing wall, it may be that what you want to know is very far away, but there's a route to get there. You just have to figure out what the next step is, on the way.
Mm-hmm.
And this sense of the interconnectedness of knowledge pervades the ancient world. And it's also what we mean when we talk about a Renaissance man. We talk about, that's now a buzzword or a code phrase for just somebody that knows a lot of things, who can do a lot of things. But the reason that man is the figure of the Renaissance is because it's in the Renaissance that people are recovering this classical idea of the disciplines arrayed in some sort of beautiful harmony. Or in Boethius, you get the trivium and the quadrivium, this sense that we're on a progression from the most basic thoughts to the most sublime thoughts. And there's kind of a moment in the 19th century where like Coleridge and Goethe are sort of the last people who are able to think of the world that way, because knowledge is becoming more and more specialized and complex.
Mm-hmm.
And you get people like Coleridge saying, I'm going to go away and I'm going to become tolerably educated in every domain. And I really sympathize with Coleridge in that moment. I really feel a lot of fellow feeling with him, because after that, it just starts to look as if nobody could possibly get a grasp on every major discipline in such a way as to have a kind of bird's eye view of the whole. But now it does seem to me as if that's urgently necessary, and we ought to recover this sense that things are interconnected, because they still are. It's like the structure of human knowledge didn't change. It's just that the picture has become much more detailed, which is a beautiful thing if you can, again, remember to pull back and understand that all these things are related to one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to come back to talk about your book some more, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about your podcasting, because you've taken a deep dive, and a very successful one, into this space as well. Your podcast called The Young Heretics. Talk about this. What was your inspiration to get into podcasting? Was it a natural extension from what your dad was doing, or was this something that you had always wanted to do and a natural outgrowth of your writing and your intellectual work?
It's so interesting because we talked earlier about how a young man has to distinguish himself from his father and then perhaps come back in freedom to his father. And for me, actually, podcasting was sort of the last thing I wanted to do, because I was in a phase at that point where I really did want to create as much distinction between me and my father as possible. And this is true of writing as well. I was the last person in my life to realize that I'm supposed to be a writer. Everybody else.
Really?
Yeah. Everybody around me was sort of like, well, obviously you're going to be a writer like your dad, right? And in my adolescent years, I was like, absolutely not. I'm going to be an actor. I'm totally different from I'm not just going to follow in my dad's footsteps. Like, that's too unoriginal. And so it took me a long time to feel confident enough in my individuality that I could admit the ways in which I am very like my father. You know, there's
Right.
something kind of, I think, necessary about that. And it's important to go through that phase, because then you're not just copying your dad or whoever your role model is. You're actually maybe an apprentice, or you're following in these footsteps, but in your own way and on your own time. And similarly with podcasting, you know, what happened basically is that I did start to write and I started to gain some success. And people in the modern day, when you have a platform and you start to get attention online, the first thing they say is you should start a podcast. That's like a refrain I heard all the time. You got to do a podcast. And again, I was like, oh my, a podcast? Like, that's literally the thing my dad is most known for. And I don't want to talk about politics all the time. Like, that's not my thing. You know, I'm a literature scholar, and who's going to want to listen to me talk about literature? I mean, come on, you know, the most obscure
A lot of people.
Oh, it turns out a lot of people. Well, this was the great discovery. And so ultimately, I just thought, like, okay, well, you know, I'll do a podcast, but I'm going to do it my way. You know, I'm really going to do my own show, and I'm going to talk about the things that I want to talk about, which are obscure. And that's okay. If it's obscure, it's obscure. You know, I'm just going to do an hour every week of talking about the things that I love. And so I started this thing called Young Heretics, which is, the heresy is, you know, the world thinks these things are boring or backward or superstitious, and the Western canon is full of dead white men. My heresy is, I think they're awesome. Like, I think this is the coolest stuff ever. And if you don't agree with me, that's fine. Like, you don't have to listen to this podcast. But this is, I mean, you kind of said it, right? This is the thing that I discovered is, oh no, actually, there's an enormous hunger for this. And the minute you hold it out in an open hand, it's almost like you have to watch out that your arm doesn't get eaten up, because people are so hungry for something that isn't day-to-day politics, that is richer and deeper. And as you said, that something that lets us know we're not alone, right? Something that reconnects us to the past, so that we're not cut off in this isolated moment of crisis and uncertainty, but we're actually part of a grand tradition. And that's what I think people connected to and continue to connect to about Young Heretics. And it's what makes it a joy for me still to do, is that it's not just a walk through a museum. It's not like these are the pieces that you have to read in order to be educated or whatever. It's like, you know, these are our friends. This is the secret society that we're a part of. And that's been bliss.
Well, I'm no longer young. I'm in my 50s, but I really enjoy your podcast. The thing I like best about it is I really have to pay attention. I really have to focus, because, you know, there's a lot of deep thinking going on there. There's layers that are being peeled off of the onion there. And it's not as though you can just sort of put it on. It's not like listening to Dan Bongino. I love Bongino too, but this, when the topics that you treat and the way you treat them, you know, it takes mental focus. I think it's almost like exercise for the mind. And I don't want to make it sound as though it's drudgery. It isn't. It's fascinating, but I think it's great to have shows like yours that really you have to pay attention and really focus on what's being talked about. Otherwise, you're just not going to get it. So for what it's worth, you know, people in their 50s like your show too.
Well, I'm grateful, and I'm lucky that I started out the show saying the young in the title is a spiritual youth and not a chronological youth. And I started out saying that because people like you were very kindly saying, you know, is it okay that I am, you know, in my 50s, 60s, 70s, and I still enjoy the show? And I was saying, yes, of course, come on, come on. Now, though, it has a very different function, which is every year that passes, I think, why in the hell did I call this Young Heretics? I'm aging out of my own podcast. I'm 33 now. It's like, I didn't expect maybe to be doing it this long, because I didn't think it would be as successful as it's been. And now I'm thinking, oh my gosh, if I'm in my 50s or 60s and I'm still doing Young Heretics. But no, it's a spiritual youth. And this is something that's wonderful about the life of the mind, is that you're always a novice. I'm a novice, you're a novice, we're all novices, because, and this is something actually that you find a lot in scripture, right? Wisdom from above is first of all simple, that we're all kind of constantly recovering. All the words we speak are an attempt to kind of get back to the capital W word, which is actually quite pure and simple. But in order to do it, you have to peel back, as you say, the layers of the onion. And for me, you know, I know in my own life, I am always hungry for rich intellectual fare, but it takes effort to get the thing I'm really hungry for, because the most natural thing is to scroll on Twitter or to watch TV or whatever. And those things can be fun, and I'm not against those things, but it's kind of like, when you're really hungry, the thing you might instantly reach for is a bag of Skittles or M&Ms or whatever you particularly like. But what you really want is a steak and a salad, right? You really like it. That's what's going to make you feel most satisfied. It takes a little activation energy. So I think the service that I hope to provide for people is to get over that hump of activation energy, to just say like, okay, we're going to talk about this in a fun way. It's going to be your weekly dose, and like you'll get it, in podcast format. But once you're in that pool, it really is, it's like exercise. It's a wonderful, rigorous thing. It just takes a little bit of effort to get there. But there's so much, there's plenty of moment to moment politicking out there, and I have the highest respect for it. It's just like, I'm not going to add another one of those podcasts to the world. They're people that do it well. People do it better than I could, and are out there doing the daily commentary. So it's, getting deeper is really kind of what I'm here for.
Right. And, one of the other, if this wasn't, with this were not enough, all the writing and everything you're doing, you also have another really fascinating project that's more recent that I've been following. And this is a collaboration with your father, Andrew. This is the New Jerusalem. This is a really interesting project where you and your father are writing letters to each other and essays and publishing on this page, the New Jerusalem. This is a really interesting concept. How did you come up with this?
It's funny. It grew like so many of these projects that have grown up between us. It really came naturally. It came from conversations we were both having about our careers and about what we wanted to contribute to the world. And we're both, one thing we share that I would say my father taught me and passed down to me, although it is also something that I naturally gravitate toward. We both really share, we're happy and we're ambitious people. We're happy to be successful, but ultimately we could be sitting on a box by the side of the road and we would still kind of be talking about this stuff, that this is, there's something essential, urgent, like lifeblood to us about ultimate questions, and especially about God, which, the longer both of us live, the more it seems like God is the only thing that is worth talking about.
Right.
And everything worth talking about ultimately ends up tracing back to God at some point. And so we were just kind of discussing the fact that, we both are lucky to have venues where we can write, and there are wonderful publications that we're both involved with. But there was nowhere that we thought was really just, where our sensibility just fit like a glove, right? Where this kind of jokey, antic sense of humor met with kind of big questions, met with like palling around and friendship, where that was really could be given its full reign. And so we just thought, like, why not just kind of get out from under it all and just start something, and again, invite people in, because we've been having, we both feel we're in a crucial, pivotal moment for Western civilization, in which faith needs revitalizing, where it needs to become real to people again, that there's a God, not just like, some people believe, obviously, and it's easy to get into the habit of thinking, yeah, I believe in God, or I don't believe in God, or whatever you think. But to make that proposition real and to make it vital and part of the world that includes elephants and knock knock jokes and the Three Stooges, but also Macbeth, right? And to make God like a tangible presence in that is just something that we feel is really urgently necessary, and that for us is there when we hang out and when we talk and we smoke a cigar and we sort of like speculate on this stuff. God is so real, And so we really wanted to try to invite people into that conversation, which is why the format is, a brief letter every day back and forth between the two of us, and then one of us will kick the thing off with an essay. And it's been a real adventure of discovery for both of us, because it's we're kind of inventing the format as we go along, but it's been really joyful.
Yeah, I really love it. There's so much faith in there, and there's so much there's so much joy in that relationship that is tangible, and also just incredible content covering a whole panoply of issues and ideas, everything, from the Bible to science to your books that you're writing. So I strongly recommend people check that out. It's called The New Jerusalem. So we can't take up too much of your time. Been so grateful to have this time with you, Spencer. I want to come back, and we have something on our show that we finish off with. We close with, called the reading list. It won't shock you to learn that your books are featured today, and they're going to be added to our reading list. Your most recent book that we've been talking about today is called Light of the Mind, Light of the World. And if you haven't seen this is a really astonishing and beautiful cover. There's a story, there's a backstory to this cover that I won't tell here, but if you check out Spencer's podcast, Young Heretics, there's an episode there where, on another podcast, where he goes into great detail describing the cover and the title and how much thought went into it. And really, it's obvious that degree of thought and care also went into the writing of this book. Really, the theme is the world is not a machine. Humanity is not a mistake. Religion and science and faith are not at war. Actually, there are eternal truths that exist in the universe, put there by God, and that they tell the truth about religion and science. And so this is just a really illuminating book that we highly recommend. I read it on sort of a Kindle format. I hope that you're going to take the time to narrate a version as well, Spencer, because your narration of the first book I really enjoyed. So I hope that's coming. Your other book, How to Save the West. This book was right in my wheelhouse. I love reading books like this. I shouldn't say books like this, but I would say books in this genre. It's such a hopeful book. It tells, it's full of wisdom about the past. It's written by someone who's a classicist with a PhD from Oxford, who has a deep understanding of Western culture, of its values. And he talks about the 5 essential crises that we're facing: the crisis of reality, of the body, of meaning, of religion, and of course of the regime. And more than that, he talks about in here, he explains solutions, ones that are faith-based, ones that are eternal, that are transcendent. And so, and both of these books, folks, are just beautifully written. They're just carefully crafted prose. And so I highly recommend them, and I'm very proud to add them to our reading list. So Spencer, I'd like to come back to you. Obviously, very well read, Oxford PhD. Are there any books, and this is hard to do, any books that are special to you that you would recommend to our viewers and listeners that would maybe illuminate their understanding of some of the topics that you have been writing about and treating in your books?
Well, first of all, that's just so kind, Leighton. Thank you. And if I could sit here and talk with you all day, I would. This has been a true delight, and so nice to talk to somebody with smart and interesting questions. Let me say a few things. I mean, I often get asked, what are the 5 greatest books in Western literature or anything like that. I'm not sure that I can provide that, in part because I really want to stress to people that what I'm inviting you into is not a homework assignment or a reading list. It's a life of the mind. That having been said, there are certainly essential books that you can't get away with that do belong on any reading list. In this domain, in the domain of science and faith, I think perhaps the one that comes most readily to mind is C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis is probably my biggest intellectual hero because of the lucidity, the clarity.
It shows.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the Abolition of Man is his series of 3 lectures where he really addresses science as a philosophic enterprise. The Weight of Glory is also indispensable. So is That Hideous Strength, which is a novel. And then finally, I would say, of course, that Stephen Meyer's own book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, is a must read. If you're looking, though, just for a kind of larger picture, not necessarily on this specific subject, but on, say, the larger questions that How to Save the West treats kind of more broadly, I would say From Dawn to Decadence by Jacques Barzin is a wonderful, although doorstopper of a book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And of course, if you haven't read the Iliad, if you haven't read the Bible, if you haven't read at least a few plays by Shakespeare, those are ones just to immediately get thee to a bookstore and pick up all of those, because they will really enrich your life. They'll expand your soul. But yeah, I think Abolition of Man and Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, are great places to start with this particular topic.
Thank you so much. I have to say, admit, one of the weaknesses of my own education is in the classics, and you've inspired me to start reading some of that stuff. And so thanks for that. And thank you for taking the time to be our special guest here. Obviously, you are a remarkable person, so wise for your age, and just producing brilliant books and content for people, especially for those of us who are Christians and are looking for faith-based content that's out there, but that is also very, very intellectually astute and sophisticated. So thank you so much for all that you're doing. We wish you much success with the books and everything that you're doing. I'm certain that this new book will be a bestseller. I pray that it will be, and we wish you much continued success, Spencer. Thank you so much for being our special guest here on Grey Matter today.
It was a true pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And, I hope we'll do it again sometime.
We will. If you'll come back, we'll have you.